This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife Podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. Take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to our podcast, especially if you like it, and if you would have some comments or thoughts for future shows, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And don't forget to join us on Facebook and our Pest Geek Podcast family, where we have over 1,800 people part of our group. And there you can ask questions and engage. And I'm the person involved, obviously, with vertebrate pest control. And there's others on there with other pest control issues and insects and weeds and all horticulture and all kinds of stuff. So definitely come along and join us and learn more about this field. Well, today I want to talk a little about pocket gophers. I am very passionate about pocket gophers. I love pocket gophers. I know a lot of people don't, but I think they're a fascinating creature. But they do occasionally, or maybe frequently, come into conflict with human interests, particularly farmers. And I'm always interested in learning more about it. Well, I was doing some person turned me on to this on YouTube, talking about what's called the Gopher Buddy. Now, I checked this guy out on YouTube, and he's probably in his 70s, this guy, and basically he controls pocket gophers on his own farm ground and came up with this invention that he uses with the DK1 pocket gopher trap. Now, the DK1 is probably one of the most inexpensive pocket gopher traps around. It's been around for decades, if not even longer than that, maybe even 100 years. Can't quite say, but it's an oldie, right? And so it is definitely a death clutch number one. There's a death clutch number two, but a DK1 version. I'll show you, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But this device is for this particular trap, but I think you could use it for others. I certainly have. So I bought a couple of them. I bought one and tried it out. I'm not making any money off this. I tried to get him to interview on my podcast, to talk to him. He hasn't taken me up on it. I think he's a little shy. But basically what he does with this is he finds the plug, the pocket gopher plug, and then he screws this into the ground, into the plug. We're talking about the lateral tunnel here. And then once he gets it in deep enough, then he just pulls it out, and then he turns it around and uses this little hook to dig it out. And his theory is you want to disturb the lateral tunnel as little as possible. Now, I've always been using a trapper's trowel, a narrow trowel, and I dig it out wide enough, and then I have to get my hand in there because I have a kind of a fat hand or a wide hand, and so I've got to make it bigger. And his philosophy is you want to disturb it as little as possible, make sure it's all smooth. So how do you know you're down to the main tunnel? Well, I guess you kind of have to feel for it. I can't say I'm an expert in using this yet, but I have tried it, and it's interesting. I want to try it a little bit more. I did trapping for several days on a producer's property that had a grass alfalfa mix, and it's certainly an interesting idea, and I'm fascinated by it. But I wanted to sort of turn others onto it. And I'll give you a link to his YouTube webpage. But if you search Gopher Buddy, Gopher Buddy, the Gopher Buddy, you can learn about it. He's got about 4 videos, and I'm just fascinated with it. Now, he has another part to this, namely in terms of how it's used to set. And so some people have trouble setting this trap. Now, I basically just set it the old-fashioned way, and I just simply, put it on here, and you put the trigger on. Put it on kind of deep, and then you basically grip it real hard here, and then just spin it around, and then you adjust the trigger so that it becomes a little bit of a hair trigger here. and you're good to go. That's basically setting your trap there. And that's basically it. Okay, some people have trouble doing that. So I would suggest using the Gopher Buddy, and we'll show you how he uses that there. Let me take the tension off there. So he basically inserts the trap in like this, because there's 2 holes in it. And then basically you kind of hold it in with your thumb. Excuse me, I have to put the trigger in first. My apologies on that. I normally don't use it, so I'm just going to show you here. So you put the trigger on, and you kind of slap it in there like this. Okay, hold it down, and so now you've got, you can go right around like that, and you can do that. Now he has another little bar that he uses to give you even more mechanical leverage. Actually, he says it's 3-to-1 mechanical leverage, so it's even easier. Obviously, I didn't use that here. I suspect most of you wildlife control operators wouldn't need that extra bar, but if you find maybe you get injured and you lost some hand strength or whatever, certainly you could do that, but then you're kind of good to go. So it's an interesting little device, and I'm just sort of turning you on to it here to something to check out. But I wanted to spend a few moments talking about one of his theories about this trap, because he actually talks about modifying the DK1. And I was fascinated by it, so I basically checked it out. So let me show you what he's referring to. Whenever you're dealing with a mass-produced trap, there's always going to be some issues with a certain percentage of them because of the tolerances of the manufacturing process, right? It makes sense because these are banged out by a machine, and sometimes things aren't quite what they could be. And so that's what he talks about, how sometimes you need to modify. And so what happens is when we're putting the trigger on the jaw, you have to kind of wedge it in there. And sometimes in order to get things to fit, you have to kind of bend it down because sometimes this bar is way too high. And so if that bar is way too high, it's too difficult. Then you have to bend it down in order to get it onto the trigger. He then says what happens is you have what's called a weak jaw or a lazy jaw. And you can see that here a little bit in this one because you can see a gap between the jaw and the bottom bar. So this one isn't bad, but it's still not necessarily ideal because he wants this, you want it to lay completely flat. And you want this not to have a big problem. And so what happens is when you're bending it down, you create that weak or that lazy jaw, he says. Well, I never thought about that before because I've used this trap a lot when I was doing some research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I published an article, you can go online and look it up, where we talked about some research on whether you leave the burrow open or leave the burrow closed. And we were using the Maccabi trap and the DK1. And we were testing it both in alfalfa fields and in grass fields. Okay, we were testing it in both environments. So I was always, when I found some traps like this, I would just simply press this right down and force it. And he said, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have to do that. So how do you fix that? Well, he says what you do is you get yourself a 7 30-second file, rat tail file, and a round file, and basically the same type of file you'd use to sharpen your chainsaw. There's one I purchased here from Oregon. I don't make any money off any of this, folks, okay? So just want to be sure on that. So here's your 7 30-second file. And then what you do is you have to file a gap right there. You're filing right here so that it looks more like this. Let me release it so I don't hurt myself. So that it looks like that. See if I can put both of them together so you can see a comparison. We're having some video issues here. Obviously, this is some kind of close-in work here, so please bear with us. Here's the one that's been modified. Versus the one on my left and your right that has not been modified. So what you're doing is you're taking the file and you're filing off here to create this little groove. And the reason you're doing that, and let me try to show you, is that it makes it easier for this trigger to pop out. So notice maybe it's hard to see in the screen, but when I'm pushing this on, I don't have to put as much force into ramming it in there because there's more movement allowed by me filing away some of that bar. And then I don't have to push it down as far because there's more movement allowed because I filed that bar. Whereas in this one, let's spread the jaws out. Now I've got to push that in and I've got to crank this down in order to get that trigger on. Why? Because that fatness there in that bar has to be ground down. Now, thankfully, you don't have to do this for all the traps. But his theory is that by having this jaw easier to move up, you have less misfires because, in fact, only one of the jaws is actually moving. And I never thought about that before. Well, anyways, he has 4 videos on using this particular trap. I can't give him a full-on thumbs up that he's definitely telling the truth. He's not lying. I'm not suggesting that. But whether he's accurate or not in all that he's saying, I don't know. But what I am saying here is I think that he's onto something in terms of all 4 of his videos. I think he's onto something that you want to consider if you end up using the DK1 trap. If you are using the DK1, I'm going to strongly encourage you at least consider what he's referring to and what he's talking about. And I think that it will improve your capture success. I still haven't fully proven it out yet, but I think he's onto something. If nothing else, it will force you to think differently about your pocket gopher traps, particularly at the DK1, and I think it will make you a better trapper because his philosophy is that he should always be catching a pocket gopher. He should never be having misfires or his traps buried, and I think he's onto something, and I want to encourage you to check him out. So I'm going to provide a link onto this video. Again, I'm not making any money off this. Here's the Gopher Buddy. It's not that expensive. I think it's $25 post-paid, and this is a rugged piece of equipment, okay? There's another item. There's another bar that comes with it to help you set your trap, and he has a little bit of instructions with it, or you can just view his video. A really nice guy, and I think that we need to be thinking more carefully. We have a lot of people that spend hours about how they're putting together their coyote traps and other types of traps, but we really haven't paid enough attention to our pocket gopher traps. And I think it's high time that we did, because I think our capture success should be a lot higher than what it is. And that's basically what I wanted to tell you today, and have you check this guy out, the Gopher Buddy, and his technique. And I think if nothing else, it'll make you think differently about your pocket gopher trapping. It certainly stimulated my thinking in a lot of different ways. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel, wildlife control consultant. Again, I'm really glad to have you on board here on the Living the Wildlife podcast. Do take a few moments, drop me an email at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And again, we want you, always remember, we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care.